When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Goblin Jr. channel. And today's video, we're going to be doing my conclusion, my overall general thoughts on A Dance with Dragons. How does it measure up to the other 4 books of the main series? What are its strengths, its weaknesses? What is this book really trying to tell? What does George want us to come away with in this book, and things that I took away from it? So, if you did want to catch up on this, this is basically the last video of A Dance with Dragons that I'll be doing that isn't a compilation. I'll do one more video where it'll be compiling all my videos together, but I have basically gone through every single chapter in this book in some detail in a numerous parts dating back to last year. So check those out if you want more information. I also did a POV ranking video as well, just to give you guys my thoughts on each POV as a whole, and I'll briefly touch on all of them in this video as well. So my overall thoughts, my things that I came to when I got to the end of this book and things that I compiled as I was reading it, this book feels like a more extreme version of A Clash of Kings. In every sense, it follows almost the same format. Clash of Kings, the people that really like it, they like it because of the high moments, some of the best written moments, specifically the Stannis plotline, the Catelyn plotline, Tyrion's plotline, the Arya plotline. People that don't like this book really go on. There's some low points of the book. Daenerys' plotline. Some people don't really like Arya's plotline in Clash of Kings. Jon is probably at his weakest of the entire series. Bran is not so great in this book. So Clash of Kings, to me, of the first 3 books, has the lowest floor in terms of it has some of the weaker chapters. It's prone to having some weaker chapters here and there. But at the same time, it also has a huge high, right? Some of the high moments of Clash of Kings are really high. Dance with Dragons is very similar, albeit I think a bit worse. I think the floor for Dance with Dragons is incredibly low in terms of the quality of a chapter in a general sense. Like if you went to a random chapter in A Dance with Dragons, the chance of it being a great chapter or being a bad chapter, there's a wide variety there, right? It's either going to be one of those two. There's not a lot of, whereas A Feast for Crows I talked about, there's a lot of like middle chapters where they're solid chapters. They're not bad, but like they're not like anything crazy. Feast for Crows, the one issue I think Feast for Crows has is it doesn't have a ton of standout chapters that you remember. Dance with Dragons has that. Dance with Dragons has both of those things. It has chapters you remember that you really don't like, notably a lot of Tyrion's plotline, some of Quentin's worst chapters, but it also has a ton of great chapters in there that really stick with you. You know, you think about the end of Cersei's plotline, you think about Theon's whole plotline, Jon's death, Daenerys riding Drogon for the first time, a lot of standout moments. And so Dance with Dragons, in my opinion, is the most inconsistent book of the entire series. It just varies wildly from chapter to chapter. Whereas A Feast for Crows, I talked about that, it was the opposite, right? It was a very consistent. We were always like right here. Maybe we would dip a little underneath it or we go a little higher than it, but we never really, varied too much from just being a good baseline of that book. I compared it a lot to a Game of Thrones, even though Game of Thrones I think is better than Feast for Crows. Again, Dance with Dragons, very similar to Clash in that regard. Outside of that, I think Dance with Dragons to me is the book that has aged the poorest, in my opinion. I used to have Dance with Dragons as my 4th favorite book. I've always kind of gone between A Feast for Crows and Dance. They are fighting for kind of 4 and 5. I always like the first 3 better than the last 2 because they kind of feel like, one story is the first 3. They feel very connected. And then the last 2 are, they're kind of very connected as well. So to me, I look at book 5 and I'm someone that personally didn't really enjoy the big low moments of this book. And there's a reason that when I was going back through this book, and I want to point this out, I'm not, hating on A Dance with Dragons. I'm trying to look at it from a critical point of view. I still really like A Dance with Dragons. It would still be probably in my top 10 favorite books. But in terms of comparing it to the quality of the other books in the series, I just had a tougher time with this one on a reread, especially in the first half. I started doing this retrospective back in, I believe, March or April of last year. So we're going, close to a year on doing this retrospective, which is completely different than A Feast for Crows. A Feast for Crows, I got through it pretty quick. It was I kind of banged that out. I didn't take any breaks. I just kind of went through that pretty quick. A Dance was not that case. I needed a bit of a break from the book. When you have that first half of the book and you have so many plot lines that are just not at their best, right? When you get to Tyrion after he leaves young Griff, almost every time you see Tyrion as a POV, you just don't want to read the chapter. And you also have the exiting of really good POVs in the first half of the book. So there's this weird transition where, yes, when you do get to that like back three-fourths of the book, it's just great. Most of the chapters are some of the best of the entire series. But it's that transitional period when you start losing POVs like Davos, who is my third rated POV of the book, Bran, who I was really positive of in this book. You lose both of those. They don't show up, right? They just kind of end halfway into this book. And you have Tyrion entering that back half of his. You have Quentin, who's still a very prominent POV, given that there's a lot of characters in this book that have just around that 2 to 4 POV length or count of chapters. And he's pretty prominent in the first half, especially. He kind of is weird because he has 2 chapters that are relatively close together in the first half, and then he has two chapters very close to the very end of the book. So he's another weird one as well. But to me, this book, when it was in its best, the things I love the most, and one of the things that I think George was trying to tell with this story was when we were looking at characters being put in situations where they have to rule, where they have to be the person in charge of a lot of different people and trying to get cultures to blend together. My favorite parts of Daenerys' plotline specifically was when we were focusing on how does Daenerys, deal with this whole freedmen and slavery issue, right? You have a foundation, a city, or I would say more of a land mass in Essos that has known slavery for so long. How do you transition now to a period in which you uprooted all of that to have people that are all freed? How do you deal with those issues? How do you integrate those two cultures? How do you deal with, slavers rising up again and enslaving people, like what happens basically in Astapor when all those refugees are coming to Marine? How does she deal with the plague that's happening right now, the flux? I loved those aspects of Daenerys a lot. It really took the foundations of A Feast for Crows and Cersei's plotline specifically of the struggles of rulership and heightened it in this book. And Jon also has to deal with that in a very similar but different way. Jon is Lord Commander. He has to somehow be able to manage Stannis and the Queen and their faction throughout this book. He has to try and get the wildlings and the Night's Watch to see eye to eye to fight this common threat of the others. And we see that both of these leaders, Daenerys and Jon, fail. By the end of this book, both of them fail. And I think that what George is trying to show us is how difficult things can be. Having ideas are great, but how do you integrate them? How do you be a leader? You have to have so many, different skills to make you a good leader. You have to be able to communicate effectively, right? Lead by example in a lot of ways. Something that Jon, I think, fails to do much later in the book when he's saying he's going to go to Winterfell and all this stuff when he's the Lord Commander, even though we understand those emotions. And so I think he does a really good job in this book putting us in that position. The other main part of this book that I really enjoyed that was definitely a big strength was when we took characters and we investigated their past, right? We looked at characters like John Connington and Theon. They're the two main ones in this book that we're looking at their past. We're having them visit places of where they used to be when they were younger. So John Connington, for instance, in his second chapter, when he goes to Griffin's Roost, that chapter is great, exploring the decisions he made, the mistakes he might have made, and how those change him as a person. Theon is obviously, to me, the best POV of this book. He carries especially the early to mid part of this book. Every chapter that he has only improves and gets better and works on the foundations of the last. It ties perfectly into his Clash of Kings arc and, his whole journey of self-discovery, becoming, a better version of himself, becoming a new Theon, as you will. As he's leaving this character of Reek and this trauma that he's experienced under Ramsay, his chapters are incredibly dark. They're fascinating. And by the end of it, you feel very fulfilled by what occurs in this, right? You get this idea of Reek, breaking away from Theon, and now he's in Stannis'. And so a lot of those themes, when they're talked about, are really done extremely well. You also have things like greed, all as always, and you have, a lot of the other themes that George likes to do, anti-war. Those are not nearly as present as, say, they were maybe in the last book. Like, anti-war was a big one in the last book with Brienne's arc. We don't see Brienne outside of the very end of a Jaime chapter that we get in this book. We do have also a sense of, feuds. How do people put their feuds, you know, away? How do those ties to histories of generations of violence between families, how does that get resolved? We see that a number of times, whether that's with the Bracken Blackwood issue that we see through Jamie's POV, which is one of my favorite chapters of the book, of course, but we only get one Jamie chapter, which is unfortunate. But learning this history between the Blackwoods and the Brackens, which it seems like neither side really has the full truth of what actually occurred, and this has caused violence between the two families for years now. We see the same idea with the wildlings and also the Night's Watchmen. We see that between northern houses in the north, for instance. We see this with the slavers and the freedmen and marine. It's a very present theme, right? Looking at how families and different people have had rivalries and issues with each other and how that affects their decision making. We kind of see that with the Dorne plot as well when we get the Ario Hoda chapter in this book. So there's a lot of those themes that I think that when he focuses on those things, he does a really good job. Talking about some of the things that, going back to what I really, did not like in this book is George definitely in A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons had much more of a focus on filling the world out, the world building, and I think it's not as noticeable in The Feast for Crows because when he's introducing these other plot lines, like the Dorne plot, like the Greyjoy plot, they serve a purpose to the overall narrative, and they also forward the plot while also building new characters. And one thing I didn't like in this book is, it seemed like George didn't manage that as well in this book. Tyrion to me is the perfect example. Tyrion, his whole journey is basically him journeying to Marine. A number of characters doing that in this book. Think about how many characters are trying to reach, Daenerys in this book. You have a character like Quentin, whose entire journey was foreshadowed in the last book with Arianne, and how he's going to try and fulfill this contract that was between Viserys and also Arianne. So it's kind of different terms. And so Quentin has this little journey of trying to get to Marine. That plot line is very convenient. Quentin himself isn't that interesting of a character. His plot line isn't original, given the fact that we already have Tyrion trying to make his way to Marine. Later on, we have Victarion trying to make his way to Marine. And so, Quentin, unfortunately, is of those three plot lines by far the most boring. And he's not a good character. At least with Tyrion, he's a good character, so we care about him more than we do with Quentin. Victarion's fun. So the thing I'm trying to get at, though, is the point is like a lot of these chapters feel like, oh, okay, we want to see more of Atlantis. This is George's time to show us more about how these other cities work. And the problem with that, like that isn't a bad premise when you think about it, but the idea here is just not very good in execution, right? It's a lot of walking around, and aimlessly. Or it's Tyrion with Jorah, and they don't bounce off each other particularly well. And so it's not very interesting to read in general. So there's that aspect of it that I think really holds this book down, that there is a lot of chapters that the plot isn't moving all that much. Character development isn't forwarding that much, really. And it just feels like world building and just filling out the world. It feels like kind of stuff you would see maybe in Fire and Blood, but with Fire and Blood, it makes more sense because Fire and Blood is meant to be a history book. It's meant to like fill out the world and history of Westeros and all that. It just doesn't feel all that natural a lot of the times, or it's not very interesting or compelling to read in A Song of Ice and Fire, especially in Dance with Dragons. So, there's that part of it that I really didn't enjoy all that much in this book. I think that, this book, a lot of its problems really just rely on kind of Essos. I think the Essos side of the story in this book wasn't very good for the most part. Like, Daenerys is solid. I think that she's definitely a middle of the pack POV. I had her ranked like 10th, which sounds bad, given how many chapters she has. She has 10 chapters in this book. But at the same time, I mean, to me personally, she was solid. She just never really was that great outside of one chapter. I think Daenerys 9, where she rides Drogon, fantastic chapter. I just felt very mixed about Daenerys' plotline throughout, mainly because I think the love interest plotline just to me, I just didn't enjoy reading it because of how much focus is on that. Even not even in Daenerys' chapters, like other people's chapters, like I mentioned with Daenerys. Daenerys, like she was fine in this book. I think that it's better than A Clash of Kings in terms of her plot line. But I think Storm of Swords and Game of Thrones are just miles better than her in this book, unfortunately. I think Jon in the North is where this book shines. And also the Feast for Crows characters, they get POVs in this book. Because one thing that Dance with Dragons gets that unfortunately for Feast for Crows doesn't get, and one of the reasons Feast for Crows to me doesn't really touch the first three books is because of a lot of the conclusions aren't really like, wow, those are great chapters, best of the series. A lot of them aren't like that, outside of maybe Brienne. But when you have, for instance, Cersei's Walk of Atonement in this book, which is by far one of the best chapters in this book and of the series, it gets basically the conclusion of the feast arc, right? Cersei comes in for two banger chapters and fulfills her feast arc, and, we get into Winds of Winter. So Dance Dragons definitely has the luxury of getting to finish off a lot of the stuff that George spent an entire book building in A Feast for Crows. Arya's storyline, her plot, her two chapters that she has in this book are far better than they are than in Feast for Crows with her three. So, you have Arya's conclusion is solid in this book. The North stuff is great. Jon's good. Theon's good. Asha's great. Stannis' plotline is fantastic. So you have a lot of really good plot lines, in the North and, in those other characters that are coming back from Feast for Crows, Victarion as well. It's just the ones that have such a heavy focus in Essos. Quentin, Tyrion, Daenerys, those three characters between them, they have a ton of chapters. Like that's 26 chapters, and if I was to pick and choose out of those, I'd say, maybe 4 or 5 of them would be in my top 30 to 35 of this book. That's not great. And so I think where this book struggled was by far, I would say, some of the more main plot lines of the book. Daenerys, Tyrion, even though I think Daenerys is fine, again. So, long story short, when looking at this book specifically, I think your strengths were, I think there were some really good themes that George covered that I talked about earlier in this video. I think the North plot was a huge strength. I think the Feast for Crows POVs that came back in this book, great. I think a lot of those highs of this book were really high. Like this book ends on a fantastic note. I think if you ask casual fans, people that have only read the books once or maybe twice, A Dance with Dragons I think would be more highly rated than me, for instance, because this book ends so well. Now, it doesn't end perfectly. I'll talk about that in the negatives, but it does end really, really good. Like, you have Quentin's death, you have Barristan, they're about to fight the slavers. You have Jon's death, Theon and Asha, reconciling. There's a really a lot of great payoffs that's been built up throughout this book. Cersei's end, Arya's end. So a lot of great stuff that ends on a really high moment that makes you excited and wanting to read, especially the last chapter, the epilogue. Kevin, I think the best epilogue of the story outside of maybe Daenerys, even though I know it's not an epilogue. It's not, Daenerys is not the epilogue character. It's, doesn't carry on the tradition of the story. But Daenerys has the best ending chapter, I think, of all the books. But Kevin is second. And that chapter leads you on such a high note to wanting Winds of Winter. And so I did this as well. I think I think it was my POV rankings that this book ends so well that you remember it. You remember A Dance with Dragons more than you do A Feast for Crows if you've only read the books probably once or twice. And I think it sticks with you more. So I do the season 6 effect. Season 6 is not a good season of Game of Thrones. But because it ends on episode 9, which is Battle of the Bastards, and episode 10 with all the stuff, the Sept of Baelor, Cersei's plotline, some of the wrapping up of some of the other plotlines, which are really great, Jon Snow's parentage reveal, all of those things. So because season 6 ends on such a high note, most people will say that season 6 was better than season 5, for instance, right? Because of the way season 6 ended. Where in reality, I personally like season 5 better than season 6 because season 5 is more consistently has good quality moments outside of it all just being in like the last like maybe episode or two of a season. And that's kind of how Dance Dragons feels with Feast for Crows. Like Feast for Crows is more steadily good throughout the entire book, whereas Dance is all over the place. It varies heavily from chapter to chapter. So, yeah, that's kind of my strengths for this book. I think it has incredible highs. Some of the plot lines are great in this book. Some of the highest moments of the series. Some of the themes that are brought to the table were fantastic. Negatives of the book really do include, Tyrion and Quentin. I would say the Essos plot in general could have been a lot better, could have been condensed more. I think that really would have helped this book as a whole. Again, incredible lows. The floor of this book is much lower than I think the rest of the series. I can't think of any other book in the series that has this amount of chapters that I would say is probably in the top 10 worst chapters of the entire series. That's not great in this book. I think, something I haven't mentioned, some of the finales of the characters get cut off. The Battle of Ice, the Battle of Fire, probably the Battle of Steel we should have seen with the stuff at Storm's End. All that stuff gets cut out of this book. And so you have some characters that end on really weird notes. Like Asha's been building up to this battle with the Boltons the entire book, and that gets cut off as soon as she meets Theon. Really weird way to end Asha, even though she's really good throughout the book. Weird way to end it. Barristan, albeit, I really like his POVs at the very end of the book. He ends on another weird note. It seems like with Daenerys, we've been building up to this conflict with the slavers the entire time. That never happens in this book. It gets pushed over to the next book. John Connington and the Young Griff plotline seemed like it still had more to do in this book and kind of gets cut off, which is unfortunate given it's one of my favorite plotlines going into the next book. And so I think this book, where it concluded some characters incredibly well, like best of the series, others you still are really anticipating them, but in this book as a whole, they don't conclude that great. It feels kind of weird where George, placed these characters to stop their story. And so, getting to the end of this conclusion and, all of that, I really want to say I was very critical of A Dance with Dragon. I think there's more to talk about in terms of what A Dance with Dragons does well and what it doesn't. And, it's very different from Feast for Crows, where I feel like A Feast for Crows, it's a consistent book throughout. So there's not a lot of like super huge negatives to talk about with that book. Whereas this one, there definitely is. I want you guys to know, regardless of what your opinion is of this book, I know a lot of people like this book, like in their top 3. I do like this book. I love this book, but it has flaws. I can love something and still point out things I didn't enjoy about it or things that had flaws in it, right? I love the Star Wars prequels. I can realize those have flaws in them. So, I hope you guys all did enjoy, this series. We'll have one video left, and we'll end it out after that.